This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Time for Part 3 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle. Per me de regnant. The city-states of the rulers of Troy, Orchomenos, Tiryns, Bog-Haz-Koi, Mycenae, Knossos, and cities and states without number, and of which not even the name or memory now remains, too often, little expectant of calamity from without, from whatever cause, finally went down into smoking ruin before the deluge of wild men who, with their reeking swords, brought all those God-ordered ages of ancient time to a bloody close. Men such as the wearer of the golden mask, whose grave was opened by Heinrich Schliemann in his excavations at Mycenae, and who he believed to be Agamemnon sleeping his everlasting sleep. Buried sword in one hand, with the other, this giant amongst men, still clutched in death as in life, those discs of gold which so obviously were storehouse of wealth and power. Thus it is clear that by permitting gold to be equated with wealth, or that which had been money, and forgetting thus the true nature of money as a thing apart, his law alone, merely a device of transferable numbers to assist and give order to the exchanges amongst his people, this God-king from whom descended the legend of that company on Olympus, was already surrendering his might and the freedoms of his peoples to those inscrutable shadows that lurked in the dimness of the distant Babylonian counting houses. To these rulers, power was already in the merchants' and master miners' precious metal pieces. With such precious metals as they stripped from the bodies of living and dead, in those cities they had so gleefully sacked and put to sword, when peace came again, they were able to purchase those items of luxury so much desired by their women, such as were manufactured in the cities of the Mesopotamian plain and Egypt, if not further afield. More important still, they were thus able to obtain the finest of arms that skilled craftsmanship could fashion, such as the suit of bronze armor found at Media in Greece, the very best of the master armorer's trade. Thus they readied themselves for the next slaughter. It may very well have been, as in today, when the new aggressors, designated communist as according to the meaning of that word, may very well be preparing for the destruction of those easy-going people of the Anglo-Saxon world, from whose skill and technique derive those finest of arms, through which their world could indeed be threatened with total obliteration. That in their position as ruler all gold flowed through their hands, whether in those forms given to it by goldsmith's art, or in those shapes most convenient from the point of view of its use in international exchange, there is no doubt. The latter case was clearly shown by the rings and discs and the tiny double-headed axes as found at Troy, all of gold, and the 400 round pieces of gold and the 150 golden discs that were found in the royal tombs of Mycenae, dating from circa 1500 BC, by Heinrich Schliemann, all of which clearly represented some form of exchange or money. Spirals of gold wire, also found in the grave of one member of the royal family of Mycenae, are suggested by Saltzman to be adjusted to the small Aegean gold talent of 8.5 grams, which he classifies as the Aegean gold unit. Herein would be implication of the use of a gold unit in international exchanges even at that early time. The rings of gold wire of a few grams weight, which circulated in Egypt and in the reign of Tahutmes III, would appear to afford some verification of this fact. Gold or silver money, whether ring money or other form of money, if of definite weight and fineness, would always be desirable in international exchanges. As an interesting and pertinent digression, it also appears that spiral or ring money may have come to occupy a place in the economic life of Egypt, too, as early as the latter years of the so-called Old Kingdom. Its use and abuse, considering the Egyptian trade that existed across the known world during the reign of Pepi, Pharaoh, who reigned 90 years during the 6th dynasty, may have been one of the factors by which the international money power of the time, in whatever form it existed, brought about the total collapse of kingly rule in Egypt in the years subsequent to the death of this ruler. The Hebrew records also appear to verify this use of metal rings, or spirals, being used in settlement of trade balances between foreigners, or of being storehouses of wealth. According to Madden, however, there is no mention of gold money in ancient Hebrew records, though gold constituted part of the wealth of Abraham, undoubtedly refugee from Ur, about the time of its destruction by the Gutim. The 600 shekels of gold by weight paid by David for the threshing floor, and the oxen of Ornan, and the 6,000 shekels of gold taken by Naaman on his journey to the king of Israel do not imply money. Nor can the passage, "They lavish gold out of the bag and weigh silver in the balance," or "Wisdom cannot be gotten for gold, neither shall silver be weighed for the price thereof," be brought forward in favor of gold money. Gold was generally employed for personal ornament and for adornment of the temple. It is probable, therefore, that a system of jewel currency or ring money was in use. The case of Rebekah, to whom the servant of Abraham gave a gold earring of half a shekel weight, and 2 bracelets for her hands of 10 shekels weight, proves that the ancient Hebrews made their jewels of a specific weight, so as to know the value of these ornaments in employing them in lieu of money. That the Egyptians kept their bullion in jewels and rings is not merely indicated by the scene on the monuments, as mentioned by Lenormant and Maspero, in which they are represented as weighing rings of gold, silver, and copper, but also by the findings of archaeology, such as the copper rings found at Tel Amarna, stamped with the cartouche of Khuan-Aten, Hyksos ruler. These rings would appear to have been retained in the treasury at Tel Amarna, and therefore still were current 200 years after the expulsion of the so-called Hyksos. According to Breasted, gold and copper rings of a fixed weight circulated in large-scale business in the time of the Old Kingdom, and, significantly enough to the student of banking, or private money creation and regulation, as it might be better known, stone weights were already marked with their equivalents in such rings. The circulation as money of these promises to pay, recorded on stone, pointedly suggests the likelihood of the activities of a secret fraternity whose hereditary trade was private money creation. It may very well have been the debilitating force that, with the death of Pepi II, in 2476 BC brought about ending in turmoil and anarchy to the even flow of the undeterminable age over which the god-kings reigning in awesome splendor so long had spread their mantle of man-consideration and true benevolence. I'll tell you what I'm getting from this so far. This is fascinating. One of the things I've always wondered about, you hear that old saying thrown around nowadays that on average, in 1976, people threw this around a lot. Subsequently, they still do. But they say that if you look at history and look at empires last, on average, about 200 years. That's the average lifespan of an empire, so they say. Babylon lasted about 100 years. Rome lasted a lot longer than that. The longest ever running one is like 1,200 years, and that was the Byzantine Empire, so-called Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. But so 200 years. But I used to wonder growing up. I used to sit and say, yeah, if this nation is threatened, I mean, we have these modern bankers, these banksters who are selling this country out. So if this country only lasts a couple hundred years or something like that, or a little bit more, the process of destroying the country was unnatural. I always used to think this. It will have been unnaturally expedited by these international banksters. We have traders inside the gates who are trying to build this new world order, who are facilitating and expediting this collapse of the United States. Well, and I used to think it was not a natural occurrence in history. It was atypical. Well, reading this book, The Babylonian Woe by David Astle, he's making the historical point now that I didn't know about, that apparently, if I'm reading this correctly, David Astle's showing that pretty much every civilization had its bankers, its banksters, acting as termites within the gates, within the walls of their own house, who likewise brought about, expedited the decay and final collapse of their own country, and they didn't care about their own. It was all about profits. Yeah, I guess that makes more sense. So the banksters of today, they're not atypical. Egypt, Rome, they all had them. Ancient Greece, they all had their banksters eating out the house in which they live. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, anyway, back to the book. Further evidence that the Egyptians kept their bullion in jewels or rings is indicated by the passage from Exodus in which it is related that the Israelites, previous to their departure from Egypt, borrowed, quote, jewels of silver and jewels of gold and spoiled the Egyptians, unquote. In consequence, it would appear that the money used by the children of Jacob when they went to purchase corn in Egypt was ring money, the use of which was permitted by the Pharaoh Egypt of the time, rightly or wrongly. Their money is described, bundles of money, as verified by the authorized translation in Deuteronomy. Then shalt thou turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shall go unto the place where the Lord thy God shall choose. The excavations of Heinrich Schliemann indicate that such ring money was also used by the Mycenaeans at perhaps rather later date. Thus the Greek city-state, owing its existence to an uncertain long period, during which there took place those events that led up to the final days of Knossos and Mycenae, was the result of the union of the forces of order in life and death that motivated the priest-king, were he at Knossos, or at Thebes, or Tel Armana, or serving the moon god at Ur, leader amongst the Sumerian cities, and those forces that drove on the builders of the battlements, first of all unearthed by Heinrich Schliemann at Troy and Mycenae. Whether priest king or peasant king, their wealth was already assessed in terms of the weight of their store of precious metals, which would be so eagerly accepted in exchange for the products of the master armorers employed by the bankers who already controlled trade and money creation in those cities of the ancient Orient, from which cities, therefore, the glory of total guidance by the God-will had already departed. He, who was literally the Son of God on earth, as he meditated in his island fastness of Crete, was beholden to none other than the people below, who he served from his place as the apex of the pyramid of life itself, and to the will of the one above who appointed him to serve. The peasant king at Mycenae, or Troy, or wherever it might be, for all his seeming rock-like strength and a certain godlikeness in character of the kingship he bore, as was indicated by the title Wanax, necessarily existed as instrument of those who manipulated gold or silver supplies internationally. This has always gone on. And at the same time, the slave market. Men of a class who, in that control of prices which they so clearly exercised, were able to control prosperity in all those seemingly powerful states that had accepted the international valuation of silver as the factor determining international or national values. Such as was the case with most of the mainland cities. They may have been, as it seems they are today, a close-knit conspiratorial group threaded through the priest and scholar class of these cities and lards, though not of themselves of such origin. The answer may be found to lie in the existence in very ancient Sumeria of a privileged class who, having access to the credit of the temple, thus were able to control the masters of the great donkey caravans who carried such credit or will of the god of the city from one place of business to the other, incising record on their tablets of loan of such credit made to enable purchase or interest overdue, or repayment of such loan as had been made the previous trip. These persons, who may be considered themselves to derive from the hereditary caravaneers, and who must have functioned as bullion broker and banker, would have been fully clear on the subject of silver and its function in settlement of foreign trade balances, and its use as a standard on which to base money accounting. In these latter days of the city-states of Sumeria, it is reasonably clear that during certain periods of decay, a languid and corrupted priesthood might delegate to these persons not only matters of trade, but also those decisions relative to foreign states, so essential to the continuance of the might and right of the god of the city. The special international character of the outlook of these people, sprung as they undoubtedly were from the donkey caravaneers, born to be at home amongst all peoples, yet to always bear in mind the peculiar business of the caravan merchants, their trade and profit, may not have made for decisions as from a true and dedicated God-servant. Thus it may very well be that we must look to the professional caravaneers, from whom descended the Habiru, for widespread dissemination of the knowledge of the possibilities offered to merchants by development of the practices relating to private money creation, deriving from a clear understanding of the meaning of accounting to a silver standard, and later the potentialities towards development of monopoly, of trade, inherent in the actual use of silver as the material on which the numbers of the abstract unit were stamped. The full extent of the possibilities towards the accumulation of wealth through exploitation of varying ratios between silver and gold in different parts of the world, and the possibilities of a private and secret expansion of the total monetary circulation, which was open to those who were held in such esteem in the cities that persons were glad to deposit their valuables with them for safekeeping, may also have been known to them. As such accounting to a silver standard had long been known in the lands of Sumer and Akkad, and the mainland generally, control of values had long since been in the hands of the silver bullion brokers, whoever they were, and the money lenders and bankers and their satellite merchants, without reference, as in former days, to priesthood and temple scribe. Through bullion they controlled money, and through money creation, on that bullion as base, they controlled manufacturers. According to T.B.L. Webster, in his book From Mycenae to Homer, quote, undoubtedly, Ugarit and Alalak were more concerned with manufactures than Knossos and Pylos, and silver by weight was already for them performing the function of money, whereas, as far as can be seen in the Mycenaean centers, no such standard existed, unquote. However, the fact that the Achaeans derived their system of measurements from Mesopotamia would certainly suggest that the most important measurement of all, the monetary unit, would equally originate from such source. This opinion is further strengthened by the collaboration obviously existing in the Mycenaean settlement at Ugarit with that money power which based itself on silver by weight, such as clearly controlled the manufactories of Ugarit and Alalak. Further, according to the same scholar, quote, the Alalak tablets also record copper distributed to smiths, but note in addition it is to be used for making baskets or arrowheads. And the king of Assyria sent copper to Mari to be made into nails by the local craftsmen. A report from Pylos that the woodcutters in 2 places are delivering 150 axles and 150 spars for the chariot factory may be compared with the Ugaritic texts on the delivery of wood for the making of arms, and a note of wood delivered to the carpenters for the construction of wagons in Alalak. We may add here also from Pylos a list of wooden objects made, a list of vessels received by men, perhaps mayors, in various places, and a note of pieces of ivory, to set beside this rather slender evidence of Mycenaean manufacture. Alalak provides a record of 64 business houses and their produce. They include smiths, leather workers, joiners, and cartwrights, unquote. Thus it seems that where the conception of money as to a silver standard existed, as at Ugarit and Alalak, so also existed organized industry, including outstandingly the private manufacture of arms under methods that appear to be those of semi-mass production. It is not without significance that this early era of privately issued money, such as was silver money, and consequent private industry, particularly that which was devoted to arms manufacture, was in certain areas so coincidental with the massive movements of warlike peoples and the collapse of ancient empires that had lived long under the pattern of life known as that of the ancient Orient. Conquering peoples needed the best of arms,
seems that the best of arms were obtainable from private industry. And private industry in its turn needed silver or gold or labor which was slaves in payment. Both were obtainable as the result of war. Therefore, parallel, though not entirely the same as in today, the more war, the more the industry, and the more the need for the products of the money creator's ledgers. Hence became the more absolute the control of that which most of all designs industry and its accompanying slavery in one form or another, namely, private money creative power. Thus, regardless of what strength still resided in the heart of the temple states of the ancient Orient, if values were dictated by the international valuation of silver bullion, then, above all, the internationally dealing silver bullion brokers would be in a position to see to it that manufacture and distribution of arms was under their control, the factor most important of all in international power allocation. They were in a position to have manufactured in some scale, controlling labor as they undoubtedly did through control of the slave trade, the finest weapons known in that day for those rulers who collaborated with them and served their best purposes. Boy, this is the story you don't get from any other history book that I know of. Clearly, by the same token, with such total money control, they were in a position to withhold the best of weapons, or the materials for such weapons, from those who served them the least. In a world that had come to believe in money as an absolute, such was the position long ago, exactly as in today. Thus, the state that rejected international money power, as did Sparta and Rome in ancient times, and Russia in modern times, had to be prepared to establish total military self-sufficiency. The Cretan civilization that communicated its ancient language through the pictograph script known as Linear A, which recognizably came to communicate Greek through that development of this script known as Linear B, about 1500 BC, would certainly seem to have been conquered by Greek-speaking peoples some reasonable period previously, which would suggest about 1700 to 1600 BC. At the same time, according to Breasted in 1675 BC, the so-called Hyksos, a Semitic conqueror, entered the delta regions of Egypt, establishing total military supremacy through the use of horse and chariot, previously unknown in Egypt. The evidences of Ugarit and Alalak tablets, although of a substantially later date, about 350 years, indicating semi-mass production in these areas of chariot parts, arrowheads, and arms of various kinds, cannot but suggest that it was from this region, so close to the copper of Cyprus and the wood of Anatolia and Lebanon, that money power armed those restless peoples that may have inundated Crete in earlier times and Egypt somewhat later. The chariots by means of which Egypt had been subdued can only have been paid for out of the booty of conquest, the plunder of tomb and temple, and the sale of enslaved peoples. The fact of the persistence of the thrust of Tahutmes III into these regions substantially less than 100 years after the eviction of the Hyksos by Ahmose I, 1500 BC to 1557 BC, from their last Egyptian stronghold at Avaris on the eastern marches of the Delta would indicate no idle, pointless advance, but definite design towards destroying the heart of the enemy. The elimination of his financial and industrial centers. Whether they were still in the regions of Ugarit and Alalak, or now sheltered elsewhere behind the kingdom of Kadesh, perhaps in Mitanni, would not be known. However, that both sides had equal access to the international arms industry would certainly be indicated by the spoil in manufactures of war of the Battle of Megiddo, 1479 B.C., as won by Thutmose III against the king of Kadesh and his allies, amounting to 924 chariots and 200 suits of armor. By corollary, it may reasonably be assumed that opposed to these chariots as seized at Megiddo would have been at least another 1,000 chariots. Alexander of Macedonia, venturing far from home in later times, was a reckless adventurer, considering that at the Battle of Issus, October 333 B.C., the whole Macedonian army amounted to little more in numbers than the Greek mercenary center of Darius, which was but a small part of the Persians' enormous, if undisciplined, host. Thutmose, who ruled Egypt from 1501 to 1447 B.C., was the god-king of a great and ancient state, to which occupation by the detested Hyksos had so recently taught a severe lesson in that which was modern warfare in those times. He was descendant of a line of kings 2,000 years old or more, and it is very doubtful if he would have moved abroad without careful organization and planning. To build his 1,000 or so chariots was needed the wood of Lebanon and Syria, and those districts surrounding the Gulf of Antioch. Also was the craftsmanship of its cities of Ugarit and Alalak needed, or at least of that so strategic district, whatever its name at that time. Also, equal financial and industrial organization to that which clearly was available to the kingdom of Kadesh, suggested by Breasted to be the last flicker of political and military power of the Hyksos. Thus it would appear that money-creative power had definitely re-established some form of agency in Egypt where, under the conditions of the empire, its best interests lay. The agreement between Thutmose and the Phoenician cities, particularly Tyre, demonstrates concessions made to traders in order to obtain the sea power which he so much needed for the success of his campaign against Kadesh. The fact of gold and silver rings of a few grains' weight circulating in Egypt as against day-to-day purchases indicates the nature of the concessions by Thutmose to that money-creative force which undoubtedly drove the worldwide trade of the Phoenician cities. The gifts in silver bullion from the Khita or Hittites, natural enemies of the kings of Mitanni, indicate that they knew that which would be most welcome to the Pharaoh and would most of all weaken his leanings towards friendship with Mitanni or other peoples likely to have been their enemies. Okay, we're going to take a break and see you in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're back, finishing up the second half of Part 3 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle. The temples of Egypt clearly retained immense wealth and holdings in land and still conducted their own trading expeditions. However, from the reckoning of Breasted that 1 person in 50 and 1/7 of the land was owned by them, it is clear that by the times of Ramses III, 1198 to 1167 BC, and to whose reign this estimate is applicable, the true force behind kingly rule, which is the will of the god, so that king and temple need to own nothing, as being all in all, they owned all and were all, had long ago been gathered up by those promoting the conception of private ownership. Such conception of private ownership would naturally derive from that right these persons had already arrogated to themselves to create and manipulate the monetary unit, tangible or abstract, and thereby stimulate the growth of a private enterprise for good or ill. To such an extent had this change in the substructure of life proceeded that, by the time of Solomon, first Hebrew king in Jerusalem, approximately 955 BC, the chronicler was able to write, "And a chariot came up and went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver," therein being indication that the international money power of the day deemed it safe to locate its most important industry, which was that of armaments, in the land of Egypt, at least after the barbaric but definitely more pliable Libyan dynasty had become established. Ancient ways and ancient morale gave way to foreign influences and the period of self-criticism, and therefore self-immolation that always seems to follow the advent of the penetration of international money creative force. Such money creative force and its key arms manufactories, so much needed by the war powers of that day, would always continue to maintain itself, come what may. Possibly its heartland was some area such as Switzerland today, that, by tacit consent of all powers, remained neutral in all this strife, and whose neutrality would always be respected by the armed force of each of the struggling states. Bingo! You ever wonder why doesn't anybody ever invade Switzerland? It's not too hard to figure out once you know this stuff. Kadesh and its allies, Arvad and Simra, is it Smyrna? It's spelled wrong if it's supposed to be Smyrna, were the military force towards the destruction of which Tahutmes III directed his efforts. The manufacturing cities of Alalak and Ugarit on the lower Orontes River and bordering on the Gulf of Antioch, respectively, because of the widespread extent of their trading operations during the 13th century BC until the time of their destruction at the end of that century by sea rovers, either ally or enemy of the Confederacy, known as the Peoples of the Sea, might very well be suspected of being headquarters of a money market at that time, even if the deep source of their money power existed in the Babylonian cities. In being a center for international trade and arms manufacture during the 13th century BC, this area may very well be considered to have been a similar center during the 15th century BC, the more especially in consideration of the agreement which seemed to have existed between the Arameo-Phoenician cities and Tahutmes, at least those who guided his policies. While therefore the neutrality of such areas was respected, money power in control of the movements of bullion internationally, safe behind this shield of neutrality as designers of the international money market, would be able to continue to manipulate war industries, always remaining in a position to allocate the latest of weapons to those states which offered them the best advantage in respect to their particular affair. The rulers of that great Egypt after Thutmose III and his conquests, although probably completely unaware of the extent of the power of this same international force, deriving as it did from the bazaars of the ancient cities of Lower Mesopotamia, obviously needed its good graces when it came to obtaining those materials and weapons so necessary for what in that time was modern warfare. As a result, although the Egyptian empire in the earliest years might very well be described as a common market existing independent of Babylonian money power, and deriving its strength from the will to be of a dedicated and instructed ruler, the sequence of events shows that through those concessions it obtained for its best services in war, it was not long before international money power re-penetrated the substructure of Egyptian life and established its usual behind-the-scenes influence, if not control, as in the earlier time that denoted the collapse of the Old Kingdom. It may safely be considered to have reassumed the position of hidden power it had held 1,000 years before, during the closing years of the Sixth Dynasty, a period in which the stone weights indicating equivalents in metal money circulated in much the same way as the clay facsimiles of contemporary coinages circulated in the eastern Mediterranean area during the days of the Athenian Empire, or as circulated the paper notes of today that formerly indicated claim on precious metal. Further indication of the activities of private money creative force in this same period exists in the evidence of an extensive worldwide trade on land and sea revealed by those items of Egyptian manufacture discovered at Dorak in Anatolia by James Millart, and the stone vases and ivory seals that were found in Crete, all of which dated from this time and bore little evidence to suggest that they were in the nature of gifts between rulers. Through liberalism and so-called progressive teachings, its most ancient instruments, wittingly or otherwise, towards the continuance of its secret hegemony, reinstituted international money creative force, seems to have brought the host land of Egypt to where it was at the time of Akhenaten, 1375 to 1358 BC, and the Tel Amarna letters, which tell of self-destruction and decay, the rejection of old values and beliefs, and the indifference of the Egyptian rulers to their trust and to the crumbling of empire. The degeneracy and complacence of the age was revealed by the fruitless outcry out of Asia from the vassals of Pharaoh, being particularly exemplified by the despairing pleas of King Abdi-Kiba of the most ancient city of Jerusalem for assistance against the pressure of the armed assaults of the Habiru. In the meantime, the military might of those grim warriors of the shaft graves of Mycenae continued to grow, and they clearly could be relied on to supply the master moneyers of that ancient world with gold and silver and slaves. Therein these robber rulers, best known from the Homeric sagas, were but the instruments by which the mysterious worshippers of the anti-god, the controllers of the extensive money-creative force deriving from the Mesopotamian cities unseen, but all-seeing, slowly undermined the walls of the temple states of the ancient world, of Crete, of Mycenae, of Troy, of Bog-Hazkoi, and of Egypt too, so finally and so completely that little memory or record existed except in the case of Egypt, even during that period which is known as antiquity. That is the period of the flourishing of Greece and Rome. What, therefore, did the international money-creative fraternity of that day need from those states that clearly forbade their trade or settlement as corrupters of all true order and peace in life, and that thus rejected their blandishments, or from any other state for that matter? What other than the plunder out of sack and ruin by those wild men they brought in from distant lands to north and to south, and to whom they offered the sweet-smelling women, the sunlit gardens, the gold and the silver, which of course would soon be theirs in any case. Of all those cities and states without number and many without name, why they disappeared or when, both as actual sites or names intertwined with historical memory, is not known, nor the story of the ending. For as at Pylos and Knossos and Ugarit too, in so many cases the flames were the final gesture of fate, which made durable to the end of time, the clay libraries and archives thus sharply defining the end of their compilation and leaving no record further. The last thrust of the relatively wild men of the north and west against Egypt, and that Egypt survived to still continue to write its name upon the page of history for yet 1,000 years, even if with the hand growing ever more weary, if successful, would have revealed the same picture. It is clear that the organization of all those western and northern peoples in confederation against Egypt during the reign of the Pharaoh Merneptah, 1236 BC to 1236 BC, was not of haphazard design. Tehenu, Shirdan, or Sardinians, Shekelesh, or Sikeli, the early natives of Sicily, Achaeans, Lycians, Teresh, or Etruscans, Danai, obviously deriving from the Goths of the northern shores of Europe, and very likely the forefathers of those in the Israelitish confederacy who describe themselves as Dan. All these nations known as the peoples of the sea could not have been brought together as a fairly disciplined group without some more internationally wise advisors in the close circle surrounding King Merai of the Libyans than his own Libyan advisors. Egypt still contained in temple and burial house a great part of the gold washed from the rivers of Africa over 1,000 years or more, despite the plunder in gold the so-called Hyksos had carried with them into the desert some 350 years before. Whether Egypt fell or the Confederate host fell, either way was profit to the international bullion traders, whose agents would have equally followed Egyptian or Confederate. After this total victory, largely won by the skill and discipline that existed in the Egyptian archery, of copper, still a most valuable metal of war, 9,000 swords were surrendered to Merneptah. A further 120,000 pieces of other copper military equipment were also surrendered. Of weapons and vessels in silver and gold, over 3,000 pieces were taken from the camp of the rulers and chiefs. This latter spoil including many swords of gold and silver. Following is an ancient quote. This from A History of Egypt by Henry Breasted. Quote, "The kings are overthrown, saying Salam. Not one holds up his head among the 9 nations of the bow. Wasted is Tehenu. The Hittite land is pacified. Plundered is Canaan with every evil. Hurried off is Ascalon. Seized upon is Gezer. Kenoam is made as a thing not existing. Israel is desolated. Her seed is not. Palestine has become a defenseless widow for Egypt. All lands are united. They are pacified. Everyone that is turbulent is bound by King Merneptah." It is interesting to note that although the hosts that fell at the Battle of Perrier, numbering at least 9,000, were almost all from the west, according to the poem recorded above, Merneptah almost immediately turned his attention to the peoples of the east. Judging by this record of the Astle, he paid some special attention to an Israel never previously referred to in Egyptian history. Such Israel would undoubtedly be a confederacy established during the 13th century BC by Canaanitic tribes, elements such as the fragments of the Hyksos or shepherd kings, whatever their correct designation, and that had disappeared into the desert some 350 years before, pursued by the chariots of Ahmose I. Elements deriving from the peoples of the sea, perhaps, and the Habiru, also known as the Apiru or Kabiri.
But who was who, or why, or what, little concerned that brain center in Babylon or Ur, or wherever it was. Whoever they professed to be, or to belong to, meant nothing. Out of death and destruction was their harvest, whether those they said were their own were theirs or not. The only reality was control of precious metal. Out of death and destruction came the releasing in that day of the all-important hoards of stored bullion, and the renewal of the slave herds to be consumed in mining ventures in distant places, garnering the increase of such precious metals. Further, as kingly rule weakened, with the increasing circulation of fraudulent receipts for precious metals and other valuables supposedly on deposit, this highly secretive interstratum of merchant classes, controlled by these monopolists of money, through monopoly of control of precious metal bullion, postulated by Professor A.L. Oppenheim to be Aramaic-speaking during the first millennium BC, would be able to finance much larger manufacturing systems than had been possible from the highly discriminatory temple loans of earlier days. Ugarit and Alalak, previously mentioned, were but early instances. While the purpose of the temple was to cause the people to live godly lives, as according to the customs of the day, and to preserve them from straying out of the ways of righteousness, as it were, the secret and private money creative power, being more concerned with the opposite, the needs of the anti-God, the destruction of the people's lives, whether of king, priest, nobleman, or merchant, or he who labored in the field, loaned without such discrimination. Out of the resulting confusion amongst rulers could come nothing but advantage to themselves and their purposes. Out of the breakup of family and home and tradition,
all that the dedicated servant of the God has in life, would come an exhausted and confused people more ready to accept slavery. Boy, that sounds like today. Corruption of the priesthood, as in today, was the chief aim of money conspiracy, and by causing such priesthood to lose sight of its high purpose, and to take that 501c3, I put that in there, and itself as the voice of God on earth, success in all its other purposes naturally followed. A quote from Leo Oppenheim, quote, "Documents of the third level originate in autonomous economic bodies ranging from collective agricultural organizations centered in families to what often constitutes de facto private enterprise inside and outside cities. The distribution of the evidence in volume and importance varies with time and region." Unquote. Private enterprise depended on privately issued money, and of such was silver. Thus, towards the establishment of manufactories, they, the international bullion controllers, needed the connivance of those corrupted temple officials who had lost sight of the meaning of that God-given power of money creation which had been theirs, and without which the God himself, the real ruler of the city, could not be truly maintained. By the time these temple officials were brought to enter into such connivance, they would be past realizing or caring, for that matter, about the destructive effects to their powers and purposes which lay in so permitting private issuance of money into circulation amongst the people by way of precious metals, or receipts for such precious metals or valuables, supposedly on deposit for safekeeping with prominent merchant houses. Thus they would be easily manipulated. With the extension of the growth of exchanges to a silver standard, such as would derive from the circulation of false receipts issued against silver or valuables, reputedly on deposit for safekeeping, no special outlay in precious metals was needed, other than possibly bribes to court and temple officials. These men, the controllers of bullion movements internationally, and of almost equal consequence the slave trade, now that their knowledge of the frauds relating to the use of precious metal money, and consequently their knowledge of that which is now known as capital, was becoming perfected, were bringing into being extensive private industries, the most important of which, as pointed out previously, were the industries relating to war. Towards the promotion of any particular industry as required by the bankers, no doubt ambitious slaves or freedmen, as eager for money as their counterparts today, could always be found. It was clearly understood that those receipts representing the weight of silver or the valuables assessed as according to a silver standard, that the bankers were supposed to have on deposit for safekeeping, which circulated by custom, or by law, which is custom, as money as to represent a definite amount of exchange units, while accepted as money, were money. The fact that the people accepted them as such made them so. Exactly. Federal Reserve notes. Their cost to the money manipulators, bullion brokers, or whatever their designation, being but that of the clay in the tablet and the scribe's entry thereon. After the final triumph of the international money creative fraternity, which may be identified in Mesopotamia
with that period of conquest, reconquest, and conquest again that began with that invasion of Sumeria by the Gutim in 2270 BC, and ended with the collapse of the empire of Ur of Ebesine before the Elamite rebels with their Amorite allies in 2030 BC, and their taking away to Usa as captive both the cult statue of the Lord Nannar, the moon god, together with the king Ebesine himself, earthly viceroy of that god. Those agents of international money power quickly concluded the work of destruction through liberalism and permissiveness, no doubt, so that by 1900 BC, the Sumerian had totally lost his national and racial identity and will to be. Sounds like Americans right now. What continued from then on was, without a doubt, a mixed breed with no special allegiance to anything other than, quote-unquote, money. Sounds very much like Americans right now. For all the same reasons. Such Asians are shown by the general evidence of history to be a class of dubious origins and antecedents. Imbued with racial self-hatred, these rascals, who are raised up in a time of national exhaustion against the former natural system of rule by a triumphant money power, too often are particularly distinguished by a readiness to please those who it seems to them are the masters, even to the downgrading and debauchement of their own kind. The apathy of a controlled public opinion to the deluge of perverted sects drenching the Anglo-Saxon countries today, bingo, which could not take place without the connivance of the so-called rulers, bingo, if only through their failure to take any serious steps towards controlling its source, is herein instance enough. However, until the violent disruptions of caravanneering about 1800 BC, the manufactures of Mesopotamia continued to flow northwards as against precious metals, principally silver and raw materials. And no doubt that trading area or common market formerly controlled by the rulers of the third dynasty at Ur continued to exist, though no longer with the Lord Nannar as signing authority. The growing manufactories of Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, in the time of the empire, Ur, in the reign of Ebesine, and of all the well-populated world, which is now known as the Near East, were instigated as a result of those secret money creative processes known only to that class of persons who have already been detailed as best as is possible out of the fragmentary evidence available, to be controlling external trade out of the Mesopotamian plain. Such manufactories, trading to the ends of the known world, would have drained south the silver of Greece, of Thrace, of Illyria, and Carpathia. Indeed, from wherever it could be obtained. It would have flowed as against settlement of trade balances to Mesopotamia. Consequently, by the time of the Assyrian assumption of control over Aram and Arabia and Egypt during the first half of the first millennium BC, money, as being a creation of the god of the city toward the well-being and good life of his people, had become a conception of which sight had been almost completely lost. It had come to be the silver injected into circulation by private persons who by then, in reality, if not so far as went general appearances, through manipulation of that inverted pyramid of ledger credit page entry money erected on the silver they claimed to hold in reserve, as apex, had now completely usurped the essential power of the temple, the creation and allocation of the unit of exchange. Thus, the total design of the city, which derived from the power of rejection or preferment formerly exercised through the money-creative powers of the god through king and priesthood, fell into their hands, where in earlier days the devoted priesthood exercised its prerogative of preferment through money creation towards the people living a God-ordered and pious life, each man in harmony with his neighbors. Those new international forces that now exercised the reality of such rule from the counting houses, contemptuous of all kingly and godly power, as undoubtedly they were, but still needing such power as front behind which they might shelter in order to better pursue their nefarious purposes, spread hate and suspicion, each man of his brother. That's exactly the situation today. Secretly promoting the concept of quote-unquote permanent revolution as being most suited towards the maintenance of their control, no sooner did stable and natural God-ordered government come again than, feverishly digging at its roots, they tore it down. Out of breakup of family and home, out of lust and drunkenness, out of the people living in disorder and love giving way to hate, they throve. That's today. That is today. The bankers thrive in misery and vice and corruption of the people, in disorder and drunkenness and lust, and that's what we all have. And the bankers are thriving. We're almost done now, where they saw signs of nobility and natural aristocracy living and thought returning, financial preferment was automatically withdrawn. He who was consumed with animal desires and ignobility of purpose, sounds like the proles in 1984, was their man and eagerly their slave, sounds like our politicians whom they entrap with little boys in private rooms and take pictures of, and then hold those pictures over their heads to get them to vote on whatever the bankers want. Their willing slave and willing betrayer of his brethren into what was planned for them by his master. Even though certain priesthood continued to maintain vigorous temple organizations, like the state-incorporated churches, long after the international control came about, such as was exercised by the great Babylonian financial houses, it may safely be assumed that such temple organizations continued to exist, like the state-incorporated churches I'm putting in here, only on account of their deference, state-incorporated 501c3 churches, their deference to these new controllers of international exchanges. In a similar manner did the Egyptian priesthood become incorporated and accept a 501c3, I am putting in here. Did the Egyptian priesthood defer to the power of Joseph as vizier to the Pharaoh? I don't know how, V-I-Z-I-E-R. Dwight the Bright, I'm sure, knows how to pronounce that. I don't. Hey, Dwight, how you doing? As a result of which, all other lands in Egypt were expropriated and returned to state ownership and administration. Dwight's probably one of the few last people who finished this broadcast out to its conclusion. Dwight and Ev and probably one or two others. Chris, you're probably, yeah, I know. This is really erudite, but it's full of profound facts, deep insights. This was a corrupted and short-sighted priesthood brought to acquiesce in the enthronement of its enemies and the enemies of the God it represented. This is the state-incorporated 501c3 churches for the equivalent of that back for ancient Egypt. I get it. I totally get this. For Joseph clearly was an agent of an external money power. And while Pharaoh leaned on him, he and that force behind him were clearly the rulers. De facto, if not de jure, they were in the place of Pharaoh. Wow. Fascinating. Okay, folks, you've been listening to all four of you who are listening still. Nah, there's a few more. There's a few more. I get a lot more listeners when I do interview shows or even monologue shows than I get a lot fewer, much fewer listeners when I do the audiobooks. But you know what? That's cool. That tells me who has an attention span. I will never devalue or think any less of, I think more highly, much more highly of the audiobooks I provide for you folks, because, I don't know, have you checked on the prices of audiobooks ever? They're quite expensive. And you're getting them here for free, and you're getting them here, and the types of books you're getting are the kinds you could never, ever find in a public library. You'd be lucky to find it in print, much less find the books that I provide for you on audio. So I know there's a small cadre of you out there who really appreciate what I'm doing. So thanks, cool. I want to read these myself, so I'm killing two birds with one stone. I'm getting it, and I'm providing it for you guys. Okay, did I say this already? That was part 3 of the Babylonian Woe from 1975 by David Astle. The history, the nefarious history of the international money powers from ancient times. This has been the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Over and out. God help us. Bless us.